Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Dialogue. I'm Taimur Shamil. Kashmiris have been fighting for their right to self-determination for the last 73 years or even more than that. And every day is a struggle for the people of Kashmir. Every day is a struggle for children in Kashmir, Indian occupied Kashmir. Every day is a struggle for women over there, for the elderly. And while the world is facing this lockdown, the Kashmiris are facing a double, triple lockdown rather. The way they have been under the siege by the Indian troops over there, hundreds and thousands of them, every day they struggle to live a normal life. Many of the areas in Indian occupied Kashmir, they don't have access to hospitals, to education, to the basic health facilities, to internet for that matter. And we don't know, the world doesn't know much about what the Kashmiris in Indian occupied Kashmir are going through. And this was felt not by any other but a UK parliamentarian, Sarah Owens, who brought up this issue at the Westminster, the British Parliament, and she raised up the issue of Kashmir. She said that the Kashmiris are fighting for their right to self-determination. And while UK talks about the liberal human values, the liberal, universal liberal human rights, UK government has to take a stance on the plight of the people of Indian occupied Kashmir. What Sarah Owens said is not just a UK parliamentarian. I think whatever she said is felt by anybody in the world who cares about the plight of human rights, the plight of Kashmiris, the violation of human rights anywhere in the world. We'll listen to what Sarah said and then we'll continue our discussion and the topics that we are going to discuss in today's program.
And I think that goes to the heart that this is a human rights issue. This isn't something that divides us politically. If you care about human rights, it doesn't matter where in the world the human rights abuses are taking place or who is being abused, you stand up and you stand up loud and proud for those human rights.
That was Sarah Owens, the British parliamentarian, clearly saying what she had to say about Kashmir. We'll be discussing the issue of Kashmir today. And also our second topic would be Afghanistan, certainly a concern for not just Afghanistan itself, but for Pakistan as well, for the region for that matter. It has a huge potential for economy and peace, but we see that still the security situation is precarious over there as well as the political situation. The intra-Afghan talks have started somewhat, but the lacunas are there. There are some hurdles that we'll be discussing today in our program. We are joined by our special guest in the studios. Our guest is Professor Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, Vice Chancellor, Sargodha University, and a renowned analyst on international affairs and Pakistan's foreign policy. Welcome to the program, Dr. Ishtiaq. And on Skype, we'll be joined by Ambassador Nafeez Zakaria, Pakistan's former High Commissioner to United Kingdom, an expert on Pakistan's foreign policy and international affairs. Welcome to the program, Ambassador Zakaria. I'll start with Dr. Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed, talking about Kashmir, you just heard Sarah Owens, British parliamentarian, and she has said what I think we have been saying for the last 73 years, the people of Kashmir. How do you see this realization in the British Parliament? The people of UK, they are talking about it. And as for Mr. Shah Mahmood Qureshi said that this is not India's internal matter. How do you see it?
Well, the British MP Sarah Owens has aptly put the issue, because ultimately Kashmir is a tale of human tragedy. You know, limiting it to territorial, ethnic, religious, historical problem is basically trivializing the issue. It is a purely people's issue, it is a humanitarian issue, and off and on we hear voices of concern, say in the European Parliament, in the House of Commons. Several times this issue has been raised by the British MPs, or in the American Congress, or in the US civil liberties, you know, setup. But somehow there is only one party which is the problem, and that you and I know is India. And India was a problem for 60 years. It betrayed the Kashmiri people, the international community, Pakistan, by not implementing the UN resolutions. But of late, in the last decade or so, its conduct has gone beyond that. And as you saw, in August 2019 by annexing the disputed territory and then dividing it. They have taken this dispute to the next level. Although Pakistan has not reacted, we have been proactively championing the cause of Kashmir, but India's action actually provides us a unique opportunity to take this matter to a higher plane of international diplomacy.
Right, right. Ambassador Zakaria, you have pursued the Kashmir issue very closely. While you were the ambassador, High Commissioner in UK, we saw a lot of activity on the issue of Kashmir. Sarah Owens talked about Kashmir. You just saw the clip. British parliamentarian talking about the plight of Kashmiris. How do you see this realization? And not for the first time, we have seen you as well meeting the parliamentarians in UK and taking up this issue. How do you see this realization this time in the British Parliament and this debate in the British Parliament?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Taimur. First of all, this is not the first debate in the British Parliament. Secondly, since 2019, August 5th, there had been 90 times question has been raised on the floor of the Parliament. That itself clearly tells us the level of awareness that is there and the realization among the British parliamentarians as to what is happening in the Indian occupied Kashmir in terms of human rights violations, and to the extent of you can categorize them, some of the activities, atrocities of Indian forces there as crimes against humanity. Now, the most important thing that need to be seen is that, is it just one party's member who's saying that? In this debate, we have seen members actively participating, the member parliament, from all across the political spectrum. We had Paul Bistro, then we have Nasha, we have this Sarah Owens who actually filed the motion, and there are many others. Over the years, since 2019, when I was there as High Commissioner, even before 5th of August and even earlier, we have been very actively talking about the human rights violations in Indian occupied Kashmir. And in this regard, I must first appreciate the British parliamentarians have taken the played a very proactive role in raising the voice for the voiceless Kashmiris. Besides that, this is not the only country where the Kashmiris have, been expressed solidarity with Kashmiris. The parliamentarians have expressed solidarity with Kashmiris, but we have seen at a very large scale there is a movement in Malaysia as well. There is a umbrella organization which is called MAPIM, which is the Islamic Consultative Council of 87 NGOs who have come together to express support and solidarity with Kashmiris. They have just recently sent 3 days back the blankets for the Kashmiris to Indian occupied Kashmir. Now, if you see the latest development,
I'll get back to you on this point on the issue of Kashmir since we are discussing it. Dr. Ahmed, just to divert the attention, interestingly, India has also been running this massive campaign of disinformation against Pakistan, because now the whole world is talking about Kashmir. We have seen the way international newspapers have been covering it, the international media, governments for that matter, parliamentarians are talking about it. India has been running the disinformation lab that was busted by the EU Disinfo lab. And just to divert the attention, they have been doing it. And not just now, for the last 15 years, the way they have been exposed by the EU Disinfo lab and what they are doing over there, and the way they wanted to undermine the sanctity of United Nations and EU for that matter, tells us a lot about their designs. How do you see this specific thing?
You see, the thing is that Kashmir is a legitimate question of national liberation. It is also a United Nations issue. It is a historical issue as well. And any amount of money which they used behind the scenes, it was RSS and these Hindu nationalists in the European context, for years this mala fide disinformation campaign against the Kashmiris just to undermine their legitimate right to self-determination in the eyes of the world.
Right.
It went on, but it is exposed. When India aggressed this time in 2019, I don't think that any national liberation issue has received as much coverage in the international media as opinion, analytical pieces, reporting of the facts that Kashmir has. So sometime, you know, these states which are aggressive states and they violate human rights, they think that by abrogating constitution or undermining the freedoms of hapless people, they are going to take an edge. But I think in the last 1.5 years, what we have seen in the diplomatic domain, India has failed. By not reacting, Pakistanis have taken an edge as far as our relationship with Kashmir is concerned in the Indo-Pakistan relationships context. And more so, globally, I think if we gather our energies and be a bit more serious in not only diplomatically but employing other means as well, other means of diplomacy, economic means, political means, I think it is a matter of time that this issue will come to the agenda of international diplomacy once again.
Right. And Ambassador Zakaria, we see changes internationally. There would be a new president in the White House. We also remember when President Trump was visiting India, the pogrom was going on in Delhi. We saw the way genocide that was going on in Delhi by the RSS and BJP right under the watch of the Indian government, and while President Trump was visiting India. New president in the White House, changes in the Middle East, changes in South Asia for that matter. Do you think that Biden administration would stand by its very slogan of liberalism, the human right values that they talk about internationally? They would also focus on this issue of Kashmir, and also US as a third party, you can say, in the region when it comes to Pakistan-India relations and the issue of Kashmir. How do you see it?
Well, I think first of all, I think he has already made it public, his views about human rights violations going on in India-occupied Kashmir and the persecution of minorities. And he has raised actually this issue during the election campaign. Now what he does after he has been elected as president, that needs to be seen. They may have other priorities also, but do not forget one thing, that if you look at American policy, they have been proponent of human rights violations. They have been proponent of raising voice against the human rights violations wherever it happens. But in substantive terms, nothing has happened actually. And you must remember one thing: every country has its own national objectives, has its own interests to pursue first, and they would actually look at the problems faced by the other countries, or even for that matter, their principles on which they often talk about, but in substantive terms, we have yet to see the actions against those who are the perpetrators, as is the case with India. Now, let's leave it there. Let's see what times will tell us as to what America, takes action. But you were mentioning about this Info Lab. You also mentioned about the distraction. Now, India has been actually using and availing every opportunity to distract the world attention. You remember 2016, 9 July, when extrajudicial killing took place of Burhan's Muzaffar Wani. And then what actually ensued, a mass-scale protest and the extreme atrocities that Indian actually perpetrated against the defenseless Kashmiris. We have seen the phenomena of mass blinding, and there is a international Amnesty International report on this, which is called Losing Sight in Kashmir. It only talks about 88 cases, but there had been more than 1,000 Kashmiri youngsters who lost their eyesight. So I think what we need to do. You are talking about one of the professor has also talked about the human rights issue, but let me tell you, there are many aspects attached to the Kashmir issue. One is
Right. We'll
political,
discuss.
that it is on the UN Security Council agenda, and it is actively being pursued by the government of Pakistan and other countries. Secondly,
Right.
it has the security angle, and thirdly, most important, is the angle of human rights violations.
Right, right, Ambassador Zakia. Dr. Ahmed, the rise of right wing is a big problem, not just in our part of the world, but globally, I would say, in Europe for that matter, the way we see it in the United States at the moment. You have spent time in Europe, you have lived over there. The rise of right wing and the connection and nexus of European right wing with the Indian right wing. That is, I think, also something that very important. Few months back, almost a year back, Indian government, the BJP government, they invited the parliamentarians of EU, European Union, to Indian occupied Kashmir. Although they visited in their personal capacity, that's what EU said, but most of them, out of 25, belong to the right wing parties of Europe. That was alarming. That is alarming for Pakistan. How do you see this nexus, and what can we do about this nexus of the right wing, of Indian right wing and the European right wing?
Well, it's a very important question. It's a timely question. First of all, it's a privilege to share this panel with Ambassador Nafees Zakaria. I spent almost half a decade at Oxford University on the Pakistan chair, and he was at that time also serving before his appointment in Canada. And I had the privilege of working with him on this narrative building, which is to promote the cause of Pakistan in the Western world. I agree with him on his assessment on the American policy on Kashmir, or generally towards South Asia. As far as this question is concerned,
Right wing.
actually Modi's rise, or the second tenure, I think it was a wave of populism in the world, including in the Western world. In Europe, from Hungary to Poland and other countries, you had right wing leaders and parties coming actually into power. You had Donald J. Trump riding a populist wave and entering power in 2016. So all of this, actually, it's a coincidence that even BJP's rise and the actual rise of RSS, the Nazis of this region, has taken place around the same time. So if populist wave was not there at the global level, I don't think that Modi would have been able to do what he has been able to do, say in Kashmir and even within India, as far as the minority, especially Muslims, are concerned. So one thing perhaps is sure, that if Trump has fallen in America, this will, I think, will trigger a similar trend where neoliberal or relatively liberal forces and the power of the right wingers will recede. If it recedes, obviously the BJP or the RSS in India will not be able to do what it has been able to do so far. So, so there is a glimmer of hope. Secondly, if not President-elect Biden, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris has been on record, and this is an issue Ambassador Zakaria and I, we debated in a international webinar that was organized by International Kashmir Coalition. I think almost 20 participants from across the world to mark the International Human Rights Day on December 10th. That she is on record having said that Kashmiris will not be left alone. So pre-election promises are one thing, but Democrats traditionally subscribe to the liberal creed. They disappoint us, and they have done so historically, as Ambassador Saab mentioned, that their commitment on Kashmir has wavered, when they are actually governing. So therefore, during Bill Clinton, even Obama's period, their argument has been consistent that until and unless India and Pakistan both agree, only then we will facilitate the bilateral process. Our stand has been consistent. Pakistan under no circumstances will leave the Kashmiris alone. That is our stated national policy. One government or another, it doesn't matter. Ideological, political differences aside, if there is consensus on one thing, that is that we will never abandon Kashmiris, because Kashmir is part of Pakistan, whole of Kashmir. It cannot be negotiated. However, our stated policy is that we will explore all possible avenues, and the best avenue, as we have championed always, is the United Nations Security Council resolutions, which should be implemented.
Right.
It's a very simple solution, and they should be implemented, because every passing decade, since late 1980s especially, the draconian laws that India has implemented, and it has been taken to the next level when we started to hear the word lockdown months before the corona lockdown was, like popular across the world. So Kashmiris are suffering. I have lost my friends with whom I have interacted. They have been killed, assassinated in India. I used to be in touch with several Kashmiri leaders personally, personal friendship. Complete lockdown, there is no information.
Right.
Some of them have been assassinated. So right, left, center, pro-India, pro-independence, pro-Pakistan, they have nabbed everybody.
Right.
And which creates the opportunity for us that across the board, Kashmiri voice is right there for the world, for us, and for all the lovers of human rights across the world, that they should reach out to them and raise their voice internationally.
Right. Ambassador Zakria, regionally, we see that India has been under pressure. I mean, India's relations with China, with Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, it has been deteriorating in the last few years, especially with Afghanistan for that matter. No role for India, rather role of a spoiler in Afghanistan. Do you think that regionally India is more or less diplomatically isolated? Globally, there would be pressure on India on the issue of human rights. Do you see it in future, since Sarah Owen and parliamentarians are discussing this in UK and internationally?
Very, very true. I must say that Indian foreign policy has been defeated on every front. None of the neighbors, they have any good relationship with them. Secondly, as you also referred to Sarah Owen's statement, I must tell you that I have been interacting with more than 60 parliamentarians over the years, and we remain in contact with each other. I'm talking about the British parliamentarians and some of the Canadian parliamentarians, and also the civil society members from Malaysia. Now, let me tell you one thing, that this has been said time and again and publicly on webinars and everywhere by the parliamentarians, especially British parliamentarians, that human rights issue cannot be taken as a bilateral issue, cannot be taken as an internal issue. And they have completely rejected any objection that has been raised by India. This is a very, I would say, healthy development that has taken place, and which augurs well for those who actually want to express solidarity with Kashmiris. Now, coming to Afghanistan, you very rightly said that in Afghanistan, India has been a spoiler. And who brought India to Afghanistan? I think this is not it's not a secret anymore. So we know who brought India over there, and we should know actually why India has been brought over there. I believe that we have to see things in the larger context, at a bigger canvas. We have to see things in the context of the competition that is there, that has been there for centuries, and that continues till to date between the major powers. Now, how India is using Afghanistan, we have just submitted a dossier to the UN Secretary General that India has been financing trouble into Pakistan. And this is not just Pakistan saying. Chuck Hagel, the Defense Secretary of the United States, has said this thing publicly in 2011, that India finances trouble in Pakistan from Afghanistan. So India is not only committing a crime by way of perpetrating terrorism against a sovereign country, by way of financing terrorism, by engaging the terrorist outfits, but it is also using some third country soil to perpetrate terrorism in a sovereign country. I believe that we need to look into all these things. Now, you talked about the European parliamentarians. Now, the European parliamentarians' visit has already been discredited with the revelation made by EU Disinfo Lab. I believe that there is a lot that needs to be done. India has actually violated all norms. India has actually defamed the UN platform. It has also defamed the EU platform, and it has actually discredited many of the NGOs which are associated officially with UN and the European Union.
Right, right. Ambassador Zakaria, thank you for your time. Pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
We'll be discussing Afghanistan after the break. Afghanistan is a concern for the region and for Pakistan as well. Peace and stability in Afghanistan is the prime thing for the region, for Afghanistan itself and for Pakistan. But as Ambassador Zakaria just mentioned, India has been playing the role of a spoiler in Afghanistan. It is important to note that in few attacks in the past, an attack on the Sikh temple in Kabul, Afghanistan, an attack on a maternity ward in Kabul, ISIS took the responsibility, Daesh, of these attacks. And the attackers were traced back to India. They were Indian citizens. India has been playing the role of a spoiler over there. Indian dossier, Ambassador Zakaria just mentioned, speaks volumes about India's nefarious designs in Afghanistan. Indian dossier was presented by Pakistan to the UN Secretary General. We'll be discussing about that Indian dossier, but more importantly, the political situation and peace and stability in Afghanistan at the moment. After this break, stay with us. Welcome back. Afghanistan is going through turmoil we have seen for the last several decades, I would say. But the recent developments on Afghanistan are important. First of all, the agreement between the Taliban and the US government, and now the intra-Afghan talks, the talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government and different political factions over there. This is a significant development, a positive development. But at the same time, we see sporadic attacks in Afghanistan. We still see violence in Afghanistan, attacks on government forces, attacks on Taliban groups for that matter, while the intra-Afghan talks continue in Qatar. Talking about the intra-Afghan talks, we also talk about the peace and stability in Afghanistan. There are regional players as well who would not like to see Afghanistan stable and peaceful. India is the only country in the region which does not want to see peace and stability over there. The Indian dossier, as we call it, was brought up by Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi and DG ISPI, Major General Iftikhar Babar, a few weeks back. And the Indian dossier actually brings up the issue that India is involved in Afghanistan to finance and support terrorist organizations like BLA, TTP, Jamaat-ul-Ahrar and Hizbul-Ahrar. The Indian dossier is important because it exactly mentions the name of the Indian officials, Indian military personnel, Indian diplomats who are involved in this subversive activities in Afghanistan using the Afghan soil against Pakistan specifically. And as I just mentioned, the terrorist organizations that they have been supporting. While Pakistan, US, China, Russia and other countries in the region, they are working for peace and stability in Afghanistan, we see India playing the role of a spoiler. Dr. Ahmed, talking about Afghanistan first of all, and then we'll talk about the Indian dossier, Indian subversive activities over there. How do you see the future of peace in Afghanistan? I mean, Taliban and the Afghans are discussing peace, but Pakistani's official statements are very interesting in this regard, and generally in the region, the stance is that this withdrawal of US troops should be responsible withdrawal. How do you see that?
Well, you see, the thing is that Afghan is an old problem now. We have had two major wars, international wars. First, the jihad against the Soviets back in the 80s, and then a gap of 1 decade, and then we had the war on terror. In each case, we have had serious social, political, economic and security implications. And we have perhaps paid the greatest price of Afghan conflict, which is why Pakistan's policy is that we will do whatever we can to facilitate this issue so that international forces should withdraw. regional involvement, especially that of India, which is destabilizing the region, should end, and all Afghans, they should come together and live peacefully so that we should also be stable. So that is the overarching, three-level analysis.
Right. And
we wish.
economic potential is huge if we have
Absolutely,
stability over
yeah.
there. You know, connecting Pakistan with the Central Asia and
You see, Pakistan is in a very different framework now. We are in a framework of regional integration. We want peace, and we also think that it is also in India's interest that India must resolve Kashmir, because no country, India is much bigger than us, can rise economically and become politically influential until it resolves the major dispute with another country. Second, through CPEC or China's rise or Central Asia's emergence, it's a great opportunity. All of the countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia and West Asia should capitalize upon that. So Pakistan is open-ended, but what Pakistan wishes is that Afghan conflict should settle in accordance with the wishes of the Afghan people, and no party, especially India, because as you know that in 1947 this northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent became West Pakistan, and this is Pakistan now. So geographically, historically, ethnically, it is us that share the long border with Afghanistan, the longest. And India, whatever it can never, whatever it does, it can never overcome these hurdles. So it is dependent upon Pakistan ultimately, if it wants to reach out to Afghanistan, to Central Asia, even to China. What we have been saying in the past, I think several years now, and especially in the last 5-6 years, is that CPEC is a great opportunity. And the Chinese OBOR or BRI, actually it includes India, it includes most of the countries of Southeast Asia, South Asia, West Asia. Let us join hands. We can only join hands if we are 300% willing to settle old issues, or like Kashmir, like Afghanistan. So ultimately, whichever angle you talk about conflict resolution in South Asia or in case of Afghanistan, everything comes down to India's attitude.
Right.
And let me say this, after this war on terror began, we had many reservations, although we became an ally of the United States. Right from the beginning, we were cautioning the international community that do not introduce another older rivalry into this relatively recent conflict. So Afghan conflict is 40 years old. Our conflict with India goes to partition, and its roots are much older.
well,
So once you brought in India, Pakistan, you complicated the issue. So first of all, first precondition, current precondition regarding the talks is that Taliban should agree to a ceasefire.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
And Taliban also in return have certain preconditions that they represent a bulk of majority of the Afghans, not necessarily Pashtun, so they should be accommodated. They were the ones who were ruling before 9/11. So ultimately it will be a consensus government, current and those who are out of power.
Right.
Pakistanis are saying, since we share a lot border, history, ethnicity and implications of the conflict, so we are the primary actor
over them.
whose interest lies in Afghan peace settlement.
Right. We are joined by Mr. Rahimullah Yousafzai, renowned senior journalist and expert on Afghanistan affairs. Welcome to the program, Mr. Yousafzai.
Thank you. Thank you.
Talking about the peace and stability in Afghanistan, certainly we want it, the region wants it, but we see sporadic attacks on the government forces over there, attacks on the Taliban groups for that matter, while the Taliban and the Afghan government talks about the intra-Afghan talks and the peace talks. A lot of uncertainty. How do you see it?
Yes, I think that's very obvious. There is a lot of uncertainty, because of these attacks. Some of the attacks have been claimed by Taliban also, like today. They claimed responsibility for one attack in Herat and the other one was in Kandahar. And then, certain attacks have been claimed by the Islamic State or Daesh. So I think there are reasons why these attacks are happening. The Islamic State is attacking because it's opposed to the peace process, and it wants to actually tell the Afghans or the Muslims elsewhere that Taliban are making compromises. They have made a peace agreement with the U.S. and now they are making a peace agreement with the Afghan government, which was brought in, which was installed by the U.S. The Taliban are launching attacks because they say they have not yet agreed to a ceasefire with the Afghan government, and that ceasefire will have to be discussed in the intra-Afghan negotiations, which are now underway in Doha. So they have their own reasons for launching attacks, but the Afghan government, the U.S., and maybe the majority of people and countries want a ceasefire or at least a reduction in violence. But that is not happening at this stage.
Right, right. But at the same time, we saw almost 10 days back that Zalmay Khalilzad, the special American envoy, he was visiting Kabul, and it was reported in the media that he wanted to meet the Afghan president Ghani, but he couldn't meet. Somehow we see that President Ghani isn't happy with his American friends, and how do you see that? Ghani administration's relationship with the Americans at the moment, what is the future of Ghani administration?
I think Ashraf Ghani was not happy with Zalmay Khalilzad even in the beginning. And, he didn't really criticize him publicly, but some of his advisors and ministers were very critical of Zalmay Khalilzad. His national security advisor, Hamdullah Mohib, made such a strong criticism of Zalmay Khalilzad. He called him a viceroy and somebody who wanted to make a deal with Taliban to come into power in his original, homeland. He actually is Afghan born. And then, the U.S. State Department was very angry, and then they stopped actually interacting with the National Security Advisor. So I think Ashraf Ghani, believes that Zalmay Khalilzad made a deal with Taliban without caring for the interest of the Afghan government. And he was not happy with Trump also, but he could not criticize him. But now he is attaching his hopes with Joe Biden, and maybe that's why he wants to wait and see what will be the policy of Joe Biden. But I think that, there have been reports that maybe Joe Biden for some time will retain Zalmay Khalilzad as a special envoy for Afghanistan. So even if they want to bring somebody new, Ashraf Ghani will not be happy because the Americans have made up their mind to leave, to withdraw their forces, and that is something which is not acceptable to Ashraf Ghani.
Right, and the whole region knows about the India's role as a spoiler in Afghanistan. But India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval was visiting Afghanistan, met Ghani, President Ghani, Hamdullah Mohib, as you're just mentioning, and these people. What is India up to? I mean, you're saying that Ghani administration isn't happy with the Americans, let's say, and they are going to withdraw. What are Ghani administration's apprehensions, and what is India there to offer?
They have close relations with India, including defense cooperation, and Afghan army officers and policemen are trained in India as well, and India has given some weapons and gunship helicopters also to the Afghan government. But I think that, India cannot replace the Americans, the U.S. or the NATO forces. India will never send its forces to Afghanistan. So I think that the Afghan government is using India to counter Pakistan, I think, and to counter Taliban. In case there is no deal with Taliban, and in case there is more fighting, they will need some Indian defense assistance. And they will be very critical of Pakistan also if the talks fail, because right now they are holding their hand. They are not very critical as they were in the past.
Right.
So we have to be prepared for these kind of eventualities. We cannot trust Ashraf Ghani, he is someone who does not really like Pakistan or Taliban. And as section of the U.S. media has reported, Ashraf Ghani is the biggest hurdle to the peace process.
Right, Mr. Yousafzai, thank you for joining us. Pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.
Dr. Ahmed, this whole situation that Mr. Yousafzai just talked about, India's role of a spoiler, interestingly, we remember Najibullah's time. Although India promised a lot of things with Najibullah, was considered close to with the Northern Alliance, but things didn't turn out to be very pleasant for Najibullah and for the Northern Alliance of that time. What I mean to say is that a lot of Afghans also think that India probably is also not a reliable partner or any sort of an actor. Indian dossier, terrorism and extremism, and at the same time, running with the hounds and hunting with the hare, hunting with the hounds and running with the hare. How do you see this whole thing?
I think right in the beginning when we started to discuss the Afghan issue, you pointed out that India is a spoiler. So right from day one, India has been acting as a total spoiler of the Afghan peace process, siding with the regime that was propped up during the war on terror precisely because of 9/11 event by the Americans and their allies. Now, the issue, like we can go back to 94 when together with Rahimullah Yousafzai, in my previous profession as a journalist, together we were there in the Taliban headquarters when they had captured only 9 provinces. So Taliban, when they rose, captured Kabul and then they attacked Mazar-e-Sharif, and there was a couple of provinces in the end by the time 9/11 took place. So you cannot ignore the Taliban factor. Now, my hunch is the same as Rahimullah Saab's, which is that because Joe Biden comes from the democratic liberal background, Trump administration, whether you are a dictator or you are violating human rights, no problem. America must disengage, America first. Age of populism, and you had this mayhem across the world. Now you have Democrats, and there will be tension within America itself, because there is a great race-centric ideological battle going to take place in America, at least within the first year of Biden administration. But simultaneously, it seems that they cannot, de-link themselves from the human rights issue. So if they bring up the human rights issue, then obviously there will be Modi regime in India will be under greater pressure over Kashmir, and perhaps Taliban, even if there was a possibility of them agreeing to a ceasefire, they won't.
Right.
So we will basically be at the same place where Obama administration left, the US power.
Dr. Ahmed, thank you for joining us. Pleasure having you on the program.
Thank you.
That is all from today's program. Pakistan is committed to peace and stability in the region. Let it be Kashmir, let it be Afghanistan for that matter. The millions of refugees that Pakistan has been hosting speaks volumes about Pakistan's stance on the issue of Afghanistan, the internal rift that is going on over there. We wish peace over there. But at the same time, we have to be very cautious about India's subversive role in Afghanistan, the way it has been supporting the terrorist organizations over there. The Indian dossier presented by Pakistan is the most important development on this issue. India is instigating, financing and supporting the terrorist organizations like TTP, Jamaatul Ahrar, Hizbul Ahrar and ISIS. The Indian dossier specifically mentions those Indian officials involved in this kind of subversive activities. While the world, US, regional powers like China, Russia, Pakistan are working for peace and stability, we see that India is playing the role of a spoiler. And Dr. Ahmed just rightly mentioned that if India wants to lead and become a leader in the region, it has to solve and resolve the issue of Kashmir and other disputes in the region and stop financing and terrorist organizations in the region. That is all from today's dialogue. See you next time. Khuda Hafiz.